The Geopolitics and Empire podcast is joined by Dmitry Orlov for what I think is our third, perhaps fourth interview over the years. Dmitry, as bombs are flying and Russian banks and communication channels are being shut by the West, I hope you have a good bottle of vodka and that all is well so far where you are in Russia.
Everything is fine where I am in Russia.
All right. I wasn't joking about the vodka. I have some Mongolian vodka left over from my time in Mongolia, as well as I've got a unique shot glass here. Hopefully it doesn't, hopefully things don't escalate to that level. But I've been meaning to get you on for a while, and then all hell broke loose. And I shot you a message, and then soon after that, I got listeners sending me messages saying, "Hey, get Orlov on." And I'm like, "Bro, chill. I'll be speaking to him in a few hours." So it's funny how we're all on the same frequency. So there's a lot going on, and I don't even know where to start, Dmitry. But have we crossed the unipolar Rubicon moment?
Yes, we're basically dealing with a lot of denial in the West. They still are in the mode of thinking, well, Russia isn't doing what we want it to do, therefore we must punish ourselves. Because that's what the logic is at this point, whether they want it or not. So what we're seeing is Russia very hesitantly undoing 30 years worth of damage, accumulated damage, while the West is busy punishing itself by trying to thwart Russia in ways that make Russia stronger. That's what I see happening. That's the really quick overview.
And maybe for listeners who don't quite get it, when you say the West punishing itself, could you elaborate on that? I'm sure you would mean like referring economically, especially and energy-wise.
Yes, mostly in terms of energy, but also socially, because unbeknownst to them, Western leaders are losing their electorate. Their electorate is wandering off looking for greener pastures, culturally speaking, somewhere else, because what they're dealing with back home from their own people is pretty much Sodom and Gomorrah 24/7, and they don't want any more of it. And they look toward Russia and other countries in the world, and they see something that they consider normal and that they see as attractive. So there are a lot of there's also some cultural collapse loaded into the equation, as well as just basic, economic energy malfunction that's unfolding.
As a Westerner myself, and there are other people talking about this on social media, that I'm still primarily concerned with what went on the past 2 years, especially the last few months, of the things that we've seen, like in Canada and in other countries, this creeping totalitarianism, this loss of our civil liberties. And whatever's going on now is really working well. This like distraction where it's just focused on Ukraine and everyone's forgotten what just happened, in Canada, where they froze Canadian bank accounts and, all of this stuff. So, I would agree with what you're saying. Something interesting you posted to your blog was regarding that Russia had full legal right to invade Ukraine for a number of reasons: to defend Donetsk and Lugansk, to stop NATO expansion, and to defend from Ukrainian WMDs. I'm not personally aware that Ukraine had any imminent access to WMDs, although I guess they were talking about getting nuclear weapons again. And there's also information going around that the U.S. had constructed biolabs all over Ukraine, and that this too was also part of the reason for the Russian operation. Could you perhaps shed some more light on the purpose of the Russian operation, as well as if you have any thoughts on the biolabs?
Well, in terms of the legal basis for the Russian incursion, I wouldn't call it an invasion. An invasion is when you move in to stay, basically. Invasion leads to occupation. This is not going to lead to an occupation. So why not call it what it really is, which is a military incursion, and basically a disciplinary function that's being carried out. But in terms of the legal basis of it, it's bulletproof. Putin is a lawyer. He doesn't do anything illegal ever. He makes sure that all the I's are dotted, all the T's are crossed in terms of the legal basis for whatever he does. Everything he does is defensible in court. And the way it looks is that the collective West is really a scofflaw in this case. They basically reneged on all the treaties they've signed, all the international agreements that they've entered into. When they say that Russia is doing something wrong, what they mean is that Russia is doing something they don't like. Whereas what Russia is doing is absolutely necessary in terms of its security. I don't want to rehash this. People should already know this, but one, the Ukraine wants to enter NATO. Two, the military doctrine of the Ukraine includes the goal of reconquest of Crimea by force, which means that in all likelihood the Ukraine will A, join NATO, and B, attack Crimea, which means that Russia will go to war with NATO. That's not a good situation for Russia to be in. Also, the Ukraine has announced, its leadership has announced that they will use their spent nuclear fuel stockpile to make dirty bombs and use their existing rockets to lob them at Russia. That's not a good thing for Russia to sit back and relax about. So those are just two aspects that dictate that Russia does something about it.
A message from our sponsors. The Nomos app will help you survive COVID-1984 and the Great Reset. Nomos is a time bank that can be used by communities anywhere in the world. You just need to talk people into using it. For example, if you go to your barber for a 30-minute haircut, your barber receives 30 minutes in his time bank. He can then use that time to pay for an appointment with the doctor. I've spoken to the developer who is passionate about creating solutions for surviving and thriving in the apocalypse. Nomos is available in both English and Spanish. Hurry and visit nomos.net before they roll out the cashless society and put you in the algorithm ghetto. Also, if you need health insurance that covers you wherever you may roam, check out my friend James Guzman's Borderless Health Insurance. One of the great things about living internationally is saving money on health care, but private care overseas can be expensive. Go to borderlesshealthinsurance.com to watch a short presentation on expat and digital nomad healthcare and sign up for a free consultation to review your options. Geopolitics and Empire needs funding. You can leave a donation, book a consultation, or become a member, which gets you access to my brief weekly commentary, a monthly newsletter of my thoughts, a private telegram, a monthly members group call, and my second premium broadcast called Dissonant Thinker, where I conduct interviews and provide solo analysis. Dissonant Thinker is also available on Rockfin and for supporters on Locals.
Yeah, I was listening to a great interview given by Scott Ritter recently, who I've interviewed as well, the former UN weapons inspector, and he was making a clear point that agrees with you, where he was saying, well, in regards to international law, where NATO bombed Serbia in '99 completely illegally, and so Ritter was saying this. Then, well, if they don't respect law in that sense, then if they can do that, then what Russia is doing to liberate Donetsk and Lugansk is also fair within the bounds. And then when NATO carves up and recognizes Kosovo. What do you think will be the aftermath? What is Russia now seeking to be done? They want to have talks. They're talking about Zelensky's not showing up to the talks. He's showing up. He's not showing up. They might meet in Belarus or somewhere else. What do you think Russia wants to be the immediate outcome of this incursion or operation?
Okay, well, just to brush on things lightly, the bombing of Belgrade is completely different from what the Russians are doing, because the bombing of Belgrade was done by the West, and anything that the West done is right by definition, whereas the Russian incursion into the Ukraine is bad by definition, because anything that Russia does is by definition bad, because the West applies double standards to everyone. And the double standards are part of the operating system. They're not to be disputed or discussed. So bringing up Belgrade is no use at all, because it's the West doing it, and the West is perfect by definition. Now, in terms of what these meetings that are, being requested and then denied and requested and denied. Well, if you have, a president of the Ukraine who's on drugs most of the time and surrounded by psychologically unstable people, this is the sort of thing you'd expect. Question is, does he even have agency to capitulate at this point? I think at this point it would be safer to basically ignore him and say, okay, well, next government, please, and let's schedule elections. And oh, by the way, the Constitution as it stands, is a dead end. There was a wrong turn taken somewhere, and everything that happened since that wrong turn is legally invalid. So let's start from a clean slate, or go back to the last valid constitution that the country had, and proceed on that basis. Again, I'm thinking like Putin the lawyer, because he will think that way, and you can't dislodge him from thinking that way. In terms of what Russia is doing with its incursion, it has two stated objectives that it is meeting. First is to neutralize the Ukraine militarily. Now, you have to understand that the only reason that the Ukraine actually poses any sort of military risk to Russia is because of its Soviet-era military strength. All of the most of the weapons it has a few new toys that it got from the West, but basically the entire structure of the Ukrainian military, the reason it could be reconstituted was because of Soviet weaponry and systems and traditions and Soviet era training that it could fall back on. If you knock all of that out, which Russians are doing, I think they have a list that they're going through, basically knocking out installation after installation. I think it's up to 1,000 installations. It's a rather large country that they've destroyed so far. Now, once they complete that list, the Ukraine will no longer have a military. There's also that little fact that the Ukrainians don't really want to fight. They want to surrender. What's keeping them from surrendering is that there are these, cutthroats, these Nazi cadres embedded with every single unit of the Ukrainian army, and they threaten to shoot people if anyone tries to desert or surrender. So that's why the desertion rate isn't as high as it should be. So the second goal is to get rid of all of these Nazi scoundrels and scum and various mercenaries and jihadis and various other people that have been shipped into all over the world, various soldiers of fortune. Basically, round them up and kill them. That's the goal. And the Russians are not going to do it themselves. They're going to turn that over to the Chechens, who are absolutely expert at it. And getting the Chechens to do it achieves two goals. One is why not use people who are absolutely expert at killing terrorists to kill terrorists? That's just basically their core competence at this point. And second, the Chechens are so scary that nobody will want to mess with them. Because touch a Chechen and you got a vendetta, and then your whole family dies. And so nobody will want to mess with that at all. So once those two objectives are met, then it'll be time to talk about a new legal structure for the Ukraine, basically blowing up into regions, letting each region decide what it wants to do. A couple of them want to join Russia. A couple more, Kharkov and Odessa, will probably eventually want to join Russia. Then there are some smaller intervening regions that basically are all Russian-speaking and probably want to get integrated into the Russian economy, as opposed to the faraway Western economy that hasn't done any good for them. And so basically there will be a a bunch of statelets along the Black Sea and all the way to the Belarusian border that will provide a buffer zone of basically Russian-speaking, Russian-aligned areas. And then, of course, Western Ukraine, which was never part of Ukraine to begin with, that was Stalin's little mistake. That'll be wrapped with a bow and handed as a present to the European Union. Here, feast on this little nugget full of Nazis and sky-high rates of mental deficiency because of iodine deficiency in the drinking water. Here you go. And that would be a reasonable resolution to the whole thing.
You think some of these regions, I've heard some people talk about, you think they would join the Belarus Russian Union state?
Well, we're getting too far ahead of ourselves. I mean, these are basically failed states, and the first thing you have to do is to get them into some kind of a fail-safe mode where they don't pose a risk to their own populations. Then there will be a lengthy period of deprogramming because these people have been brainwashed for 30 years, last 8 of them very effectively. But the thing to remember about the Ukraine is that it's basically a very large white spot on the road. I mean, it's basically just an area that everybody just poured over left and right all the time. It changed sides. I don't remember how many times, but half a dozen times during just the Russian Civil War. So the population of these places has absolutely no sense of loyalty to anything and will switch sides in a heartbeat. And I'm observing that already because as soon as the Russians rolled in with the tanks, everybody stopped speaking Ukrainian and started speaking Russian. And that just happened overnight. For 8 years, they've been forced to speak Ukrainian, and then the Russian tanks show up and it's like, oh, I don't speak Ukrainian. It's hilarious.
So if this Russian, let's call it operation, succeeds, then it would, I guess, neuter Ukraine and NATO expansion. It would disarm that whole situation. And Putin and many others have been discussing this existential threat for years, where if Ukraine joining NATO and then placing missile bases and nuclear missiles in Ukraine, which could then reach, it would be a de facto like first strike. So if this operation succeeds, then this is dealt with. Yeah.
Well, it's dealt with, but then you still have the mental deficiency in Western capitals that has to be dealt with somehow. They have to be talked down from their little treehouse and I don't know what the next step after that is, but maybe punished, like told that they're going to bed without dinner. Because what's going on right now there is just completely ridiculous. They have lost all sense of proportion and all sense of self-preservation. The Germans think that they can basically do whatever they want to please the Americans and displease Russians without basically dying of exposure next winter, which isn't the case. If they displease the Russians sufficiently, they will die of exposure next winter. That's just physics.
Yeah, there's an interesting comment that came out today from Alexander Dugin. I see you liked the post I made on my Facebook, and there's people on left and right that like him and don't like him, but I don't think you can deny the force that he has, and it's always fascinating to hear him speak. But I thought it was powerful what he said, that he said, quote, "This is not a war with Ukraine, that this is a confrontation with globalism as a whole planetary phenomenon, confrontation at all levels, geopolitical and ideological. Russia rejects everything in globalism, monopolarity, Atlanticism, liberalism, anti-tradition, technocracy, great reset, in one word." And it's clear that all the European leaders are part of the Atlantic liberal elite, and we went to war with her. Hence, is their normal response. Russia is now excluded from the globalist networks. She has no choice anymore, either to build her world or to disappear. Russia has taken a course to build its world, its civilization, and now the first step is being taken. But in the face of globalism, only a large space, a continent state, a civilization state can't be sovereign. No country will last a complete blackout for long. Russia is now creating a field of global resistance. Her victory will be the victory of all alternative forces, both the right and the left and all nations. As always, we begin the most difficult and dangerous processes, but when we win, they all share. End quote. So, I mean, for me, that's wishful thinking. I would hope it's true. Fighting against this Western globalism that's just tearing up the planet. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, first of all, again, Western globalism and global reset and great reset and blah, 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 those are all things that people talk about as if they're real. That's the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Getting back to brass tacks, what we had in the Ukraine, it was basically a population that was weaponized specifically by the United States, and then the Europeans as American vassals, as people with no sense of agency of their own, had no choice but to go along with this plan because they're infested with CIA agents at the highest level and just basically have no choice. Western politicians cannot go against the Americans because the Americans have compromising evidence on them. They wouldn't be in their positions of power unless there was compromising evidence on them. They had to have slept with an underage girl or something, or done drugs or some financial malfeasance. That's like your entry ticket. And so those are just basic things about the structure of the world. Is you have Americans who decided to use the Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia, weaponized it, abused Russians within the Ukraine for 8 years as a way of provoking Russia, thinking that Russia will attack and get bogged down and basically deplete itself of resources and have a wonderful demoralizing war of one Slavic tribe against another Slavic tribe. So that's the thinking in Washington. That was the plan. And now they're seeing that plan just fall apart before their eyes. Russian tanks merrily rolling through Ukrainian countryside and people just saying, oh yeah, Russian tanks. Okay, fine. I'll just drink some coffee or something. And that's the whole reaction. And troops just basically not wanting to fight. And they're neo-Nazis that they've trained, that they've kept in a jar since World War II, cultivated several generations of them. And then when Ukraine got its independence, injected them back into the Ukraine and eventually had them take over by lavishly funding them. They're just being trampled. They're being trounced and killed off, eliminated. So the U.S. is livid that its assets are being destroyed, and its great plans for destroying Russia are being laid to waste. They're so childish that they lash out, and because they're lashing out, the Europeans have to lash out too. What's more, to please the master, they have to lash out even harder. So you could call that globalism, or you could call it temper tantrum in the kindergarten, but it's not really going anywhere, because in the end they will crawl back to Russia and say, please, can we have some oil and some natural gas? Because basically once the United States got rid of the Venezuelan oil supply of heavy crude, it had to get heavy crude from somewhere else, because fracked oil is too light to make diesel without a heavier fraction being added. And that heavier fraction comes from Russia. So if Russia stops selling oil to the United States can no longer make diesel, and the American economy grinds to a halt. Does the US want that? Do they realize that that's what they're facing? I don't know. Now, the thing is, the United States can't really go more than a few months without Russia. Russia can go without the United States practically forever, and that's a big difference.
Just one more, I guess, question on the escalation aspect. Lukashenko came out talking about the threat of World War III, and I think he's even been saying that before this current situation developed. I mean, there's always this threat. What are your thoughts on escalating in terms, of conventional warfare in the European theater, or even when we talk about nuclear? Do you think this danger exists?
Well, it exists because the woman with the brain of a bumblebee and the face of a herring, who is now the British foreign minister, made noises about a nuclear confrontation with Russia. So that forced Russia to put its nuclear triad on high alert. But basically, that's just like, the wages of idiocy. She doesn't even have a college degree. She attended Oxford. She didn't get a degree from Oxford. She just attended. I don't know. She went to some parties and had like sex with some people or something, and now she's the she's the foreign minister of the former British Empire. It's hilarious. The level of degradation. It's like if you go to Oxford and you rub your side like a pig against the corner of some great hallowed hall, then suddenly you get to enter British government. That's how it works.
Yeah. I just, here's a silly question. I mean, a lot of people are making light of the photos that are coming out with Putin and Shoigu and Gerasimov at the other ends of the table. And then we've seen photos of like Macron and Putin at one end, and then I forget who he met with, Bolsonaro, and then they were sitting closer together. And just any thought on what's going on with the tables and the long distances there?
Oh, well, that's just Putin's way of applying discipline. Putin has basically this gradation of, the concept of cooties. It's like a grade school concept. Like you don't want to sit next to somebody who has cooties. So that's meetings with leaders are along those lines. You can tell who Putin thinks has cooties and who doesn't. So Macron has mega cooties, right? Whereas the prime minister of Pakistan doesn't have any cooties at all. And Bolsonaro doesn't have cooties either. They're totally cool. So that's that kind of level of visceral understanding of the structure of the world that Putin uses iconography in order to get his message across. His sitting very far from Shoigu and Lavrov is a completely different kind of iconography. It's the loneliness of command. It's to get all of the decisions that Putin makes are collegiate decisions. He listens to everybody. He's a politician and a lawyer. He doesn't really go out on a limb by himself. He doesn't like risks. He likes to rule by consensus within his own inner circle. We had that on display when the decision was made to recognize Donetsk and Lugansk. That was broadcast on television. That was a public meeting at the highest level with no preparation, just spontaneous. And you could see that people were trying to formulate their position, looking nervously around to other people in the room. So that was just like basically, synergy gelling right there in the room. But that's how he works. But what he wanted to get across was the loneliness of command. Of course, he discussed this with Lavrov and Shoigu. Of course, it was a collegiate decision that was made. But he didn't want that to get that across because he wanted to pose himself as the absolute arbiter of that decision. He wanted all of the responsibility to rest with him.
Right. I want to get back to the economy. I mean, for years, you've been in your books and articles talking a lot about economic collapse. And the West, just a lot is happening these days. I'm hearing that the West is intercepting Russian shipping vessels that are owned by like the Russian bank, and they're launching sanctions on banks. And I think the EU wants to make Bitcoin illegal so Russia can't skirt the sanctions. Meanwhile, there's talk of Russia and China possibly taking this as an opportunity to collectively challenge the dollar's reserve status. And so, what's your take on this atmosphere now with all the sanctioning of the banks, the crypto, the dollar, capturing shipping vessels, and all of this?
Well, what it means is that the U.S. is busily destroying the U.S. dollar as a means of international trade. Because it's basically an invalid instrument. If the U.S. can decide whether it's your dollars or its dollars, basically on a whim, then it's a high risk currency to be trading in. And so the next step is to ask the United States to pay for its imports with something else than its dollars. And then the United States loses its ability to print its way out of its gigantic deficit or multiple deficits. It has a trade deficit, it has a budget deficit, it has deficits everywhere. But basically, once the US cannot pay its way using the printing press and coercing everybody into accepting the US dollar as payment for whatever it needs, it can no longer afford whatever it needs. And then the standard of living of the average American goes down by a factor of 10 or more, and the US becomes a defunct state, a destitute country. So that's what it's engineering for itself without realizing that it's doing that. Because again, the mindset is we do whatever we want. And we don't care about the consequences because we're the strongest and the greatest. And never mind that this flies in the face of reality. We're still going to do it.
I think we may have talked about this before. I see I see more and more people discussing this. I think you've said, I've believed this for years. I think even before coming across your work, that America is going to experience its own Soviet collapse moment, like the 1990s, but it's going to be far worse. I was just listening, I think yesterday, to Daniel Estulin, another Russian, on Greg Hunter. He was being interviewed, and he was explaining that that's what's about to happen to America. You were discussing as well, Europe's going to be hurting because of the energy prices and lack of energy, inflation, just everything falling apart. How soon do you think the dollar might lose its status, and we might begin to see this unfolding in the U.S.? Because I'm already, like, inflation is crazy. Like, already we're starting to see bad signs economically. And so, what are your thoughts about the disintegration of the U.S.?
Well, there's structural inflation in the U.S. that cannot be fixed through monetary means. It cannot be fixed by turning knobs on the economy. Instead, what is needed is some kind of command and control function that doesn't exist and cannot exist in the United States. It can't even dictate where its natural gas goes. So it can promise to deliver it to Europe, but then it goes to Asia because the price is higher in Asia. And all of that stuff is privately owned, and the U.S. the government doesn't really have the structure in place to control that sort of thing. But there's structural inflation. There are basically fundamental shortages of key ingredients to maintain any sort of high level of economic activity. It's all going to dwindle. And so right now, inflation is maybe up to 10%. But really, we're maybe 6 months to a year away from it being 30% or more. If you look at producer price inflation, it's much higher. It's around 30%. And so then you're blundering into hyperinflation land. Now, the typical way that they've managed to squelch inflation before under Paul Volcker way back when was by hiking interest rates, the prime rate, to something like 18-20%. I remember it because I was old enough at the time to have made some money on that. It was great. I had some savings. I bought some certificates of deposit and they yielded 18%. That was pretty cool. But they can't do that anymore, because if they hike interest rates now, the entire economy will implode, because all of it lives on revolving credit. There are all these companies that are bankrupt or would be bankrupt if it were not for very low interest rate revolving credit, revolving debt. And if they can't revolve it, then they're done. So none of the knobs are connected to anything useful anymore. And the whole thing is just basically on autopilot until it sinks.
Yeah, so I guess that's my assessment and that of other people. That, I mean, soon I guess it's something bad is coming up. I mean, what other issues regarding the U.S. empire or what's happening now in Ukraine with Russia are you thinking of?
Well, I think that there's a huge amount of mental damage that has happened all over the West, and I see it especially in the United States. People that I consider or have considered relatively rational, I see them on Facebook, and they're definitely no longer rational beings. They're at this point mental defectives. They cannot be reasoned with, and that is probably the effect of the psychological effects of the COVID event, coupled with just inevitable denial as to what's happening with their lives, and just inability to come to terms with pretty much anything. And it's very sad. And if you have some critical number of insane people within a population, then you're opening it up to the possibility of mass insanity, which can just basically result in absolutely anything. There are examples from medieval Europe where there was a dancing craze and people danced until they died because they didn't eat, they didn't sleep, they couldn't stop dancing. And eventually they just collapsed and died in droves. That's we're heading towards something similar.
And it's funny you mentioned that, because just today, like clockwork, and social media, like this mass brainwashing, propaganda we've seen in the last 2 years. And I'm just seeing it now on my Facebook feed. I don't really like to use Facebook. I just do it to post my podcast and stuff. But people that I thought were smarter, like who at least got the COVID thing, and they're falling hook, line, and sinker for this Ukraine war thing. And everyone's putting up their Ukraine flags, and especially among the Croatians, among the Mexicans. One Croatian I know, someone posted a photo of I suppose a Russian holding a sign that says something like, "I'm Russian, I'm sorry." Like, I'm sorry for being Russian. Like, I'm Croatian. We had the war and all of that, Croats and Serbs. I would never want a Serbian to say they're sorry for being Serbian, or anyone of any ethnicity. Like, you shouldn't be sorry for being, what I'm saying, what you naturally are. And just now we're starting to see this stuff pop up, and it's just, and some of the people that were not falling for the COVID stuff are now falling for this. It's like it's unbelievable, the level of delusion. It's just, I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Well, there's a certain weak-mindedness that comes with all of this network penetration and all these mobile computing devices. People are they're basically maintained within an infantile state where they're easily influenced. And it's like this Me Too kind of syndrome that you see in kindergarten classes. One kid does it and all the other kids do it unthinkingly, just because they want to be popular and fit in. This sort of unreflexive behavior. It's in Russia, there's a different phenomenon going on, which is there's a sort of cultural elite of creative people who've had a rough time. Basically, they in the late Soviet era, they were well paid to basically be boosters for the Soviet regime, and then the Soviet regime fell apart, and they had to basically go and forage for themselves in the wilds, and they absorbed a great deal of Western culture because that sold at the time, and learned to emulate it. And then Russia developed its own kind of primitive 90s culture, similar to American ghetto culture that had to do with criminals. And so they learned to simulate that and throw kind of like parties for mafia types and that sort of thing, and made money that way. And so coming out of that, suddenly Russia is now unified and they, headed in the direction of traditionalism, and they're just completely at a loss because it's like imagine a whole bunch of prostitute drug addicts being asked to run a kindergarten or something, or a charity. They're just completely at a loss. They don't know how to fit in. What they know is that they want to be paid, because they're used to getting paid, preferably by the government. The Russian government subsidizes culture, and so a lot of them are getting paid by the Russian government, but they want to spend it in the U.S., where there's more choices of types of cheese. That's a big sticking point for them. Not enough high quality cheeses in Russia to please them. And you can buy more sequined outfits in Paris than you can in Moscow, and they're totally fixated on things like that. And so suddenly there's this war, and what they're seeing is the threat of sanctions will prevent them from flying to their beloved Europe on weekends and spending the money that the Russian government has given them, and they're livid about it. And these are the trendsetters and the influencers. I think what's going to happen is pretty sad. I think they're going to get flushed out of Russian society. I think that they're going to be painted as traitors, and they will never work again. And it's really sad because some of them are talented people.
I've been reading some of the people I'm sure you're familiar with, Pepe Escobar and Patrick Armstrong, the Canadian defense analyst who I've previously interviewed, and they're all thinking along the same lines. They're talking about the new world order, and where we see now, as we mentioned at the beginning of the interview, I think I stole that line from someone. That we've crossed the unipolar Rubicon, and that the West, this is the signal. What happened now in Ukraine is the West, officially EU, US, are declining. The East is rising. Eurasia, the dragon bear, whatever you want to call it, the multipolar world. Where do we go from here? What does the world order look like in your mind?
Chaotic. Pepe is fun to read, but he does a lot of he falls into the trap of misplaced concreteness a lot. He talks a lot about things that don't really exist, like globalization, like world order. Those are figments of somebody's imagination. Could I have a pound of world order, please? How much is it? How much is it $1? Is it $5 a pound for world order, or is it $3? Can I have a discount on it, please? What units do you measure it in? Nobody can answer those questions, therefore it doesn't exist. That's the Descartesian approach, the Cartesian approach. And so that may be fun to talk about, but what is really going on is, their personalities, their synergies between personalities, their societies that these personalities lead or head up or influence, and their arrangements, economic arrangements and social arrangements that they arrive at in various ways. So, for instance, there's this Russian incursion into the Ukraine that's unfolding, and Putin is having arm's length discussions with the prime minister of Pakistan. Now, what does that tell you? That Pakistan doesn't give a damn about the fact that there are Russian troops in the Ukraine? Well, that's the takeaway from that. So if you think that there's a world order that can harumph and wag its finger at Russia, well, you're imagining things, because Pakistan is a pretty big country. That's missing from the world order. India is not part of it. China is not part of it. So if you go down the list and cross out all the countries that are not part of the world order because they're not having any of it, you end up with what? You end up with the Anglos. You end up with their dependents, and the countries whose sovereignty has been stolen during World War II and never handed back to them. And that's it. That's really it.
Yeah, looks like, well, the tide, one historic cycle coming to a close. It's going to be interesting times going forward. I'm glad. Looks like you're more measured. You're not too worried. You seem to have great confidence in the Russian operation going on, and that we won't experience. I won't need to use this shot class then. Any final thoughts to leave us with, or other issues you might want to bring up?
Well, there are always opportunities for mischief, especially in the case of the Ukraine, because it's such a mismanaged place. So, for instance, there are 4 major nuclear power plants, including one that is the largest in Europe, that have been running flat out until recently, when 2 reactors went offline because of faults. But the Ukraine is out of coal, out of natural gas, out of money. It still has these nuclear reactors that it is using, running them flat out to keep the electric grid up. And then there's this incursion going on and this police action happening. Okay, so they took over Chernobyl, and the Russians are taking over the location of that largest nuclear installation in Europe. There are a few other nuclear installations and rocket facilities and various other things for them to either destroy or take control of. There's no option to destroy a nuclear power plant. So basically, that will turn into an occupation, most likely. Maybe some kind of a joint deal between people running those establishments and the Russians. But basically, that's a big danger. Things could definitely go wrong. But in general, people who run nuclear power plants have very tight security. Yeah, that's a requirement. And then when a tank column pulls up to a nuclear power plant, the security situation doesn't really get worse. It just means an automatic change of management. And that's what's happening. That's what happened at Chernobyl, for instance. Suddenly there's this joint Russian-Ukrainian effort in place of just the plain Ukrainian effort that was there before. And I expect that to be happening all over the place. Since they all speak the same language, the Ukrainians stopped speaking Ukrainian as soon as the Russian tank showed up. As soon as like the Caterpillar tractors rolled over the line, everybody in the Ukraine seems to have forgotten the Ukrainian language that they have been laboriously learning for the past 8 years. So that they're all speaking the same language. So I think they'll come to some kind of a reasonable accommodation. But there are a lot of other dangers. I mean, if you have the woman with the face of a herring running, British foreign policy, that's dangerous. There are a lot of other dangers like that as well. There are a lot of defense secretaries in NATO states that are really secretaries. They went to secretarial school. They're properly secretaries. They shouldn't be in charge of defense, though. They should be in charge of some paperwork function. And so there's a lot of danger there. You have a woman in charge of the EU who is a midwife by training. I don't know. I don't think she has time to deliver births anymore. I don't know what she does, but clearly she lacks the required competence for the job. And so that's throughout. Basically, the mental degradation is just really frightening. So that creates a lot of opportunities for mistakes and mischief, and I hope that a lid is kept on that. But we're living in dangerous times.
I guess finally, maybe any tip for listeners around the world, I guess especially in the West, any key principles or tips, economically speaking, to trying to stay out of harm's way. People are talking a lot about parallel structures, running to the hills, getting a farm, any themes in that regard, tips for us.
Well, I look at a lot of American cities, and they're really gone to a large extent. They're just basically they're unlivable already, and they're going to be even less livable. I would look for places that can that have the social cohesion to get by without police, and have some fallbacks in terms of food and energy, basically, if you can't find a place to live that's like that, then you'll probably wander in search of one. So get mobile.
Yeah, those are good themes, and they overlap with other guests I've had, like James Kunstler and others. All right, I think the best place to follow your work and support you is cluborlov.wordpress.com, where people can find your Subscribe Star or Patreon. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's the way to do it.
You're still on the Patreon, unlike me, but hopefully you stay on Patreon. So I hope.
Yeah. I don't know why they haven't thrown me off yet, but I think it's because my vocabulary is a little too big for the censors, so they can't detect me. They can't see me.
I probably tend to agree, or the people who program the algorithm as well. So I hope things stay calm in both Europe and Russia, Ukraine, wherever, everywhere, and we can all enjoy a non-radioactive existence. Thank you for being back on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list that goes out with each podcast and every weekend with a collection of news headlines. The newsletter and website are our last lines of defense. We're being censored and deplatformed. It's nearly impossible to find Geopolitics and Empire on the Google search engine. We've been blacklisted. YouTube frequently takes down our videos with strikes. Facebook restricts our page. Reddit and Twitter take down posts. And after the Associated Press mentioned Geopolitics and Empire in a 2021 article co-written with NATO, our Patreon account was terminated. Vimeo also terminated our Pro account. The best free way to help Geopolitics and Empire is to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or elsewhere and subscribe to all of our media channels. You can find the video broadcast now on 5 platforms: Odyssey, Rockfin, Rumble, BitChute, and Brighteon. You can find the audio broadcast on the podcast ecosystem: SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, and so on. My current favorite social media channels are Twitter and Telegram, but you can also find us on Gab, MeWe, Minds, Float, VK, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Finally, Geopolitics and Empire is in dire need of funding to continue. You can leave a donation, purchase a consultation with the host, or become a member to receive additional benefits. We also produce a weekly broadcast called Dissonant Thinker for members and Rockfin subscribers only. We will continue to fight the good fight come hell or high water. Thank you for listening.